Welcome, everyone, to our Monday devotional. If you were with us this past Sunday, you heard a really freeing message from Colin Toes called It's Not About You, and that's good news. The main idea was that when we read the Bible, we shouldn't see it as a cookbook of heroes to imitate, which puts a lot of pressure on us. Instead, the whole Bible is one unified story about the one true hero, Jesus. This week, we want to build on that foundation. Along with my guest, we're going to unpack some tools to help us see Jesus on every page. These tools, or principles, were brilliantly laid out in a teaching by Dr. Sinclair Ferguson, whose teaching entitled Preaching Christ from the Old Testament greatly influenced Colin's sermon. So, to begin, where do we start in seeing this grand story?
I think the best place to start is exactly where Jesus started with the disciples on the Emmaus Road, beginning with Moses. That means we go right back to the beginning, to Genesis. After Adam and Eve's rebellion in Genesis chapter 3, when all hope seems lost, God makes a promise. He's speaking to the serpent, to Satan, and in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, he says, I will put enmity between you and her woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This is the first glimmer of the gospel, and right on the surface is what Dr. Ferguson calls the Conqueror Principle. God is declaring war. The word enmity isn't a slight disagreement, it's deep-seated hostility. From this moment on, the Bible is not just a collection of moral tales, it's the story of a great cosmic conflict. And right in the middle of that conflict, God promises a conqueror, a specific he, who will deliver a final, head-crushing blow to the enemy.
That's a powerful way to frame the whole story. So it's not just about people trying to be good, it's about a war being waged. How do we see this conqueror principle play out in some of the Old Testament stories we're familiar with?
Once you have this lens, you start to see it everywhere. Think of the very next story, Cain and Abel. Our first instinct is to see it as a moral lesson. Don't be jealous like Cain. And that's true. But in the context of this cosmic war, it's the first battle. The seed of the serpent, Cain, whose heart is murderous, rises up and attacks the righteous seed of the woman, Abel. The conflict has begun. Fast forward to Israel and Egypt. This isn't just a story of political liberation. Pharaoh, who sets himself up as a god and orders the murder of the male children, is a perfect picture of the serpent's offspring. The 10 plagues aren't random. There are direct assault on the specific gods of Egypt. It's a cosmic showdown where God himself acts as the champion for his people who are helpless to save themselves. And then there's, of course, David and Goliath. As Colin mentioned on Sunday, this is the perfect illustration. For 40 days, the army of God is paralyzed by fear. They can't save themselves. Their enemy is mocking them and their God. Into this scene of total failure, God raises up a champion, a substitute who fights the battle on their behalf. David's victory becomes their victory. These aren't just stories about brave individuals, they're key battles foreshadowing the final, decisive battle and the ultimate conqueror who was still to come.
And that ultimate conqueror is, of course, Jesus. How does he fulfill this principle in a way that David or any other figure couldn't?
Jesus is the true and better David. Think about where his ministry begins, in the wilderness, in a direct, head-to-head confrontation with the serpent himself. It's a rematch of the Garden of Eden. But where Adam failed in a perfect garden, Jesus, the Son of God, conquers in a barren wilderness. Throughout his ministry, when he casts out demons, it's not a magic trick. He says he's binding the strong man and plundering his kingdom. He's invading enemy territory and demonstrating his authority. And then we come to the cross. On the cross, it looked like the serpent was finally winning. That was the moment the serpent was allowed to bruise his heel, and it was a brutal, agonizing wound. But in the most stunning reversal in history, the very act that looked like defeat was the mechanism of victory. At the cross, Jesus absorbed all the sin, venom, and death that the serpent had brought into the world. And 3 days later, in the resurrection, he burst from the tomb. That was the head-crushing blow. That was the moment God declared to the entire universe that the war was won. The serpent's head was crushed under the foot of the risen sun.
This changes everything. It means our daily struggles aren't just random, isolated events. So, how can a listener begin to apply this Conqueror Principle in their personal Bible reading and prayer life this week?
That's the key. It brings profound hope. For the listener, here are a few practical steps. First, when you read an Old Testament story this week, maybe it's the story of Noah's Ark or Daniel in the lion's den, ask yourself this question. How does this story show God providing a champion or a rescue for his people when they were helpless to save themselves? Look for the pattern of God's intervention. Second, think about a personal battle you're facing. It could be persistent anxiety, a broken relationship, a feeling of inadequacy. Instead of seeing it as a sign of your failure, see it through the lens of the Conqueror Principle. Recognize that while the battle is real, the war has already been won by your champion, Jesus. You aren't fighting for victory. You're fighting from a place of victory that has already been secured for you.
That is incredibly good news. To close us out, what are some prayer points our listeners could focus on today?
I'd suggest praying along these lines. Thank Jesus for being the great conqueror. Thank him for crushing the head of the serpent and defeating sin and death on your behalf. Entrust your personal battles to him. Name the specific struggle you're facing and hand it over to your champion, trusting in his victory, not your own. Ask God for eyes to see the spiritual reality behind your earthly struggles. Pray for the wisdom to see how your story fits into his larger story of redemption and victory.